Where were the Cleveland Browns 10 years ago? For this video, we're going to be turning back the clock to the year 2012 and looking back at the 2012 Cleveland Browns season. Now this is going to be the start of a new yearly video I'll be doing around this time, where we look back a decade prior and just see what the Browns looked like back then. Like, what were they up to? How much has changed since then? You know, the whole 9 yards. We're just going to be reminiscing. But anyway, let's get started. All right, the 2012 Cleveland Browns. We're going to start in the offseason. First, let's go over the regime, the power structure that was in place. The owner for now was Randy Lerner. Team president was Mike Holmgren. General manager was Tom Heckert. Head coach was Pat Shurmur. Mike Holmgren and Tom Heckert were entering their third year with the Browns. Pat Shurmur was entering his second year. Taking a look at the coaching staff, we're going to go over the offensive and defensive coordinators. Offensive coordinator was Brad Childress. He was just hired this offseason. Big hire at the time, former head coach of the Vikings. He had ties with Pat Shurmur going back to their time in Philadelphia. Pretty good hire. Defensive coordinator was Dick Duran, another big name, another former head coach. He was entering his second year with the Browns. Looking at the 2012 draft, so we're at the draft now. The Browns had 2 picks in the first round because of the Julio Jones trade with Atlanta the year before. The Browns were picking at 4 and 22, so 4th overall and 22nd overall. The Browns would end up trading up from 4 to 3 and selecting Trent Richardson from Alabama. And then at 22, they selected Brandon Whedon out of Oklahoma State. So, to give some analysis about these 2 draft picks, Trent Richardson obviously turned out to be a big bust. But I have never faulted the Browns for this draft pick because nobody saw this coming. If the Browns didn't take him, he was going to get selected a few picks later, if not the next pick. I think that's why they traded up. And that happens sometimes. They whiffed. People whiff on a player. And, really nobody saw this coming. I guess except Jim Brown. He was the only one who kind of had critical comments about Trent Richardson. But everybody else thought he was just going to be a battering ram. So, it was just unlucky. I've never faulted the Browns for this pick. Now, Brandon Whedon, that's an entirely different story. Brandon Whedon was an atrocious draft pick. He was 28 years old at the time when they selected him. I think he turned 29 in September or October. Just a horrendous draft pick. And I'm not saying this to be like a fair weather person, because after the fact, we know he turned out to be a bust. I said that the second they said his name on TV. I remember the second Roger Goodell said his name, I was just appalled by this pick. It didn't make any sense. So, yeah, unlike Trent Richardson, where I give the Browns some slack, I don't give them any slack for picking Brandon Whedon. That was an awful pick. And that was, honestly, I think that's Mike Holmgren's biggest blemish in his time with Cleveland. Even worse than hiring Pat Shurmur. Whedon was just a bad pick. Other notable picks from the 2012 draft: Mitchell Schwartz, Travis Benjamin, Billy Wynn, John Hughes. And then in the supplemental draft, the Browns picked up Josh Gordon. So other than the first round, which they obviously butchered, they picked up some good names in this draft. That's why I've always been a fan of Tom Heckert, and I'll talk about that more at the end of this video. But overall, this was a pretty solid draft. They got some impactful players here. You just would have liked them to be in the first round as well. But moving on. Some storylines heading into the season. This is a major one. The Cleveland Browns get sold in training camp. I think it was in training camp. It might have just been during the summer, but there's a change in ownership. Randy Lerner sells the team to Pilot Flying J CEO Jimmy Haslam, and Haslam takes over ownership. It would take a while to be finalized, but I think by October of 2012, he officially became the owner. So talk about a major shakeup. And that created a lot of uncertainty for the current regime that was in place, the Holmgren, Heckert, Shurmur regime. Because, whenever a new owner buys a team, he comes in and usually wants to clean house, bring in his own people. And a lot of speculation about that. People pretty much thought it was a done deal that Holmgren, Heckert, and Shermer were going to be gone at the end of the year. Now, Holmgren, that was a foregone conclusion he was going to be gone because he was basically acting as the de facto owner for Randy Lerner, because Randy Lerner really wanted nothing to do with being an NFL owner. So he had Holmgren like go to the owners' meetings for him and just do all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of a foregone conclusion that Holmgren was going to be gone. But Tom Heckert and Pat Shermer, they still had a shot to be brought back. You know, if the Browns had a miraculous year in 2012, I think if they made the playoffs or something, I think Haslam would have considered bringing them back. At least Shermer. I mean, if the team made the playoffs in 2012, then he'd be insane just to fire the coach. But I could still kind of see him firing the GM and bringing in his own guy. But anyway, so team gets sold. Major shakeup there. Creates a lot of uncertainty about the future. Another storyline was Brandon Whedon was named the starter going into the season, I think right before the first preseason game. And there was never really much of a competition with Colt McCoy. In fact, I think I read a quote, Colt McCoy didn't even take any first team reps didn't take any reps with the starters, with the first teamers. Jesus, if I could spit that out. So Whedon was named the starter, as you'd expect when you select a 28-year-old quarterback in the first round. You can't sit around and wait. You got to throw him in there immediately. You know, some fans still wanted to see McCoy. McCoy was a pretty popular quarterback, mildly popular. So there was a minor quarterback controversy, but nothing crazy, nothing like the likes of Couch versus Holcomb or anything like that. Moving on. So that takes us to the actual 2012 season. We've arrived at the season now. The Browns start off 0-5, so a very slow start to the season. However, they are very competitive in just about every game except the Giants game. And, you know, I feel like that's been every Browns team every Browns team since 99 has been like that, I feel like, you know, very competitive, but they just don't know how to finish games. They don't know how to win. You know, coming back to current day, you probably heard Jim Donovan talk about that a lot. Especially after the Jets fiasco that just happened. Jim Donovan has talked a lot about how this Browns team has to learn how to win. And back in 2012, you know, competitive young team, but they just didn't know how to win games. So they start off very slow out of the gate. They're 0-5. And major storyline. After the first game, Joe Hayden gets suspended 4 games for violating the NFL's substance abuse policy. I believe had something to do with Adderall. I don't know the specifics. But Joe Hayden suspended after the first game for 4 games. And they lost all 4 of those games, and they were sitting at 0-5. So, you know, Joe Hayden was really coming into his own around this time. He was turning into a shutdown corner. Makes you wonder how much of a difference he could have made, you know. Could they have been 2-3 through 5 games instead of 0-5? That was a pretty unfortunate loss at the time. Another notable thing from the first 5 games, I'm sure you all remember Brandon Whedon getting caught under the flag in week 1. Unbelievable. That was really a sign of things to come. But anyway, after the 0-5 start, the Browns get their act together and they go 5-3 over the next 8 games. And they find themselves sitting at 5-8. And they're briefly kind of in the playoff discussion. Not seriously, but, you know, I mean, they were, you know, when they show the graphics on the screen, they show the division leader, wild card, and then in the hunt. The Browns were in the hunt, and it had been a long time, you know, since that late in the season, they were still in the hunt. I think since 2007 at that point. This is the most, you know, recent time they were in the hunt. However, the next week, Kirk Cousins makes his first NFL start for the Washington Redskins as Washington comes into Cleveland and just shatters the Browns' dreams of any playoff chances. And I was in attendance that day. I remember seeing Kirk Cousins. It just seemed like he was just shredding the Browns. It seemed like he completed every pass. And Redskins won 38-21, and the Browns fell to 5-9, and it pretty much ended their playoff hopes. I don't know if they were officially eliminated, but they might as well have been because, I mean, who thought they were going to make the playoffs at 7-9? So anyway, Kirk Cousins shatters the Browns' hopes and dreams. Cleveland falls to 5-9. And then the Browns end up losing the remaining games, the remaining 3 games, and they finish 5-11. So disappointing end of the season for sure, since there was a little bit of excitement when they were 5-8. But anyway, so let's review some things about the season now. Trent Richardson, the number 3 overall pick out of Alabama, the franchise running back, or so we thought. He had a decent rookie campaign. He had 950 yards on the ground, 11 touchdowns. It's a pretty good number for a rookie. And I think he had another receiving touchdown. And he really turned into a fan favorite. So Trent Richardson at this point, he looked like he was going to pan out. I mean, the word bust wasn't in anybody's mind right now. I mean, Trent Richardson looked like a solid pick. And if you remember, when he was traded the next year, people were pissed. So he wasn't really like identified as a bust until after he was traded from the Browns. So, so far so good with Trent Richardson. Brandon Whedon, the 22nd overall pick. Surprisingly, he looked okay his rookie year. The interceptions were kind of high, but going off memory, I mean, I remember him looking okay. He probably didn't look as good as you would have liked for a first-round pick, especially one that's 28 years old. But I remember being okay with Brandon Whedon because he didn't look as bad as he did in 2013. In 2013, he was just awful. And that's why he got benched for Jason Campbell. But, yeah, and then even in 2012, his rookie year, he ends up setting a franchise record for passing yards by a rookie. Like, a lot of people aren't aware of that. Brandon Whedon actually set the franchise record for passing yards by a rookie. You got to give him credit for that. I've always given him credit for that because it's just surprising. You don't really expect that. And he had the record obviously until 2018 when Baker Mayfield broke it. So Josh Cribbs, the great Josh Cribbs, special teams legend. 2012 was his last year with the Browns. Remember he got that when Mike Holmgren first came in. Josh Cribbs got that contract extension, and he just never, to me, he never was the same player after that. And I think a lot of that was because when the NFL moved the kickoff from the 30 to the 35, that essentially eliminated kickoffs from the game. And I think that made Josh Cribbs just not as effective of a player. I mean, they tried really hard to make him a receiver over the years. And, to his credit, he worked hard at that and he did improve. But I never liked seeing him as a wideout. I only liked him on special teams or in the Wildcat. So anyway, 2012, Josh Cribbs' last year with the Browns. Another legend, another Cleveland legend, Phil Dawson. This was also his last year with the Browns. And he had an incredible season in 2012. I think he was 29 of 31 on field goals, perfect with extra points. And from 50-plus yards, he was just money. I don't know if he had a perfect season, but he made a ton of 50-yard field goals, including a 51-yarder at Heinz Field, which is a very difficult place to kick. So Phil Dawson, another special teams legend who was playing his last year in Cleveland. And then Josh Gordon, the rookie wideout from Baylor who we got in the supplemental draft. He had a pretty solid year. 50 grabs, over 800 yards, 5 touchdowns. Obviously, he was setting the stage for 2013 where he'd have that Hall of Fame season. And, Josh Gordon we finally had a deep threat with Josh Gordon because for years, the Browns' offense was just anemic. After Mangini got rid of Kellen Winslow and Braylon Edwards and Joe Jurevicius, they just had no receiver for years. Like Muhammad Massaquoi, who was like a 3 at best, was forced to be the Browns' number 1. And like Greg Little, and it was just a rough couple years as far as the receiving corps was concerned. But Josh Gordon kind of changed that. We finally had a deep threat in 2012. So Getting back to the end of the season, so the Browns finished 5-11, and obviously, like I talked about earlier, Tom Heckert and Pat Shurmur both were fired after the season because of the change in ownership. And, oh, by the way, Mike Holmgren resigned earlier in the year. I think back in October, he had a formal press conference, and just kind of said his goodbyes. So Tom Heckert, Pat Shurmur fired. Mike Holmgren resigned. I mean, he was going to be fired either way. So, and the word was Pat Shurmur, in the final game of the season at Pittsburgh, Browns played a pretty good game that day. Pat Shurmur was very emotional in the locker room with the team, as you'd expect. And I wish I could find video of it, but I remember in that press conference, he was you could kind of tell he was just got done crying or something because, I mean, he had been through a lot with that young Browns team in 2011 and 2012, and it showed, and he knew he was going to get fired. So it was probably emotional for him. So as you'd expect, Pat Shurmur was emotional in the locker room after the game. And that takes me to this, and I briefly touched on this earlier when I said I was a fan of Tom Heckert. I think it was a big mistake by Jimmy Haslam to come in and clean house like he did. Because what he did basically was he just cleaned house just to clean house because he wanted to. The Cleveland Browns were his new toy, this shiny new toy, this billion-dollar franchise. And he just wanted to bring in his own people because damn it, he's the owner and he can do what he wants. And that was just, in my opinion, a very poor decision because say what you want about Mike Holmgren, he put good people in place. Tom Heckert was a very capable general manager, brought in a lot of talent. I went over the picks in the 2012 draft. There were some good picks in 2010 and 2011 as well. Sure, he didn't hit on every first-round pick, which you would have liked, but I really thought the Browns were heading in the right direction. And for Jimmy Haslam just to come in and blow all of that up, to me, that was such a mistake. And the Haslams, Dee and Jimmy, they later admitted they didn't know what they were doing when they bought the Browns. And to me, that's evident. It's evident by coming in and just blowing up a good football program that was heading in the right direction, even though it wasn't exactly showing up in the one-loss column. Because the Browns' record under Holmgren and Heckert was bad, but they were building something, and it takes time. It really takes time to build a program. So I never agreed with that decision by Jimmy Haslam. I could have understood him saying, okay, you got to fire Pat Shurmur. Okay, Holmgren and Heckert, I'll keep you guys, but we got to get a new coach. I could understand that because Pat Shurmur just made so many bad in-game decisions, not going for two when he should have, and just not calling timeouts when he should have. And we all remember the famous debacle at the end of the first half against the Ravens in the second game in 2011. So I could understand him. I could understand Haslam keeping Holmgren and Heckert, but then saying you got to get a new coach. But and about Mike Holmgren. So again, like I talked about earlier, I understood why there wasn't really a place for him with Jimmy Haslam coming in, because Holmgren was kind of serving as the owner. But he is still a great football mind. And I know that when he was in Cleveland, he had a reputation for kind of mailing it in. The word was he was the last person in the building, first person to leave. But I just think he needed to be whipped into shape. He was just got complacent because Randy Lerner didn't care about anything. So it's kind of like when there's a substitute teacher in class, and the kids are throwing paper across the room and spit wads, and you're slouched over in your desk. And then the second the real teacher comes back, the mean football coach, everybody straightens up. That kind of could have been what happened with Mike Holmgren. Haslam walks in the door and Holmgren has to kind of get his shit together. And then he could have stuck around in an advisory role. Because, Mike Holmgren won a Super Bowl in Green Bay, got to another one, and then built a Super Bowl team in Seattle. The guy, I know his career ended rough in Cleveland, so that kind of tainted his reputation a little bit. but he's still a great football mind, and I think he could have been a very valuable asset to Jimmy Haslam. Now, I'm sure they would have had to restructure his contract because he was getting paid a lot of money, and I don't think Haslam would have went for that. And maybe even Mike Holmgren wouldn't have been open to restructuring, but I really think they should have kept Holmgren and Peckert and all them. But anyway, so that pretty much does it. That is a pretty good retrospective looking back at the 2012 Cleveland Browns season. Join me next year when we go over the 2013 Cleveland Browns. I'm going to wrap up the video. Hope you guys enjoyed this trip down memory lane looking at the year 2012. A lot has changed since then in the world and in my life. My God, everything's just so different. With that, I'm going to end this, going to sign off. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. Please follow me on Twitter. Follow me on Twitch. And please consider supporting me on Patreon. I have that memorized because I say that at the end of every video. Until next time, I'm Ramen Robbie, and thanks for watching.